there is still another form than that just indicated in which the indifference of law and force or of notion and being is to be found. In the law of motion, for example, it is necessary that motion be split up into time and space, or again into distance and velocity. Thus, since motion is only the relation of these factors, it, the universal, is certainly divided in its own self. But now these parts, time and space, or distance and velocity, do not in themselves express this origin in a one. They are indifferent to one another. Space is thought of as able to be without time, time without space, and distance at least without velocity, just as their magnitudes are indifferent to one another, since they are not related to one another as positive and negative, and thus are not related to one another through their own essential nature. The necessity of the division is thus certainly present here, but not the necessity of the parts as such for one another. But it is just for this reason that first necessity, too, is itself only a sham, false necessity. For motion is not itself thought of as something simple or as a pure essence, but is already divided. Time and space are in themselves its independent parts or essences, or distance and velocity are modes of being or ways of thinking. Either of which can well be without the other, and motion is therefore only their superficial relation, not their essence. If it is thought of as a simple essence or as force, motion is no doubt gravity, but this does not contain these differences at all. In section 153, we're back to considering motion, gravity, but mainly motion, something even broader perhaps. We've talked about electricity as an example, and remember too, we're not really worried about whether Hegel is getting theory of electricity fundamentally right or whether he's doing an adequate account at this point, because he's interested in thinking about these as examples for how we conceptualize laws, right? Here, as I pointed out already, he's drawing out some further implications of the fact that the way motion becomes something with law-like regularity that we can conceptualize in the understanding and then perhaps predict or, grasp the seeming necessity of and communicate it to others, that motion works differently than electricity. And he's going to use this as a substantive example to illustrate yet further what we can grasp, what we can dialectically advance to in terms of the way that force and law really work, in terms of necessity. So, we have what we've seen, the force expresses itself in a certain way. The motion, understood as law of motion, breaks itself up into two sides. The force is the unifying thing that overcomes the differences. It's abstract. The law itself works by bringing about differences that are supposed to matter, that are supposed to be relevant, that are supposed to be exactly the sort of thing that we want. Hegel points out here that if we're thinking about motion, it works a little bit differently, though. He says, there's another form than that just indicated in which the indifference of law and force or of notion and being is to be found. In the law of motion, it's necessary that motion be split up into space and time. Space versus time, essentially, right? Although not as positive to negative. So, there's a necessity here, right? For this splitting. I'm going to do this. It's necessary that motion, at least for the way that we're understanding it in terms of the physical phenomena, be split into space and time. And then he says, or again into distance and velocity, right? So that's another possibility. And we've got the splitting here. Here's something that Hegel doesn't talk about, but you might want to think about at this point. Is it necessary that law for motion express itself in these two different ways? And are they themselves opposed? He's not actually going to explore that, in part because he doesn't need to at this point, but it's something that you could think about. So he goes on and he says, since motion is only the relation of these factors, the universal is certainly divided in its own self, right? Force, in this case, the force of motion, is expressed in terms of these factors and their interrelations to each other. We can have equations in the part of the expression. Those equations seem to give us a necessity. So he says the universal is divided, but now these parts, time and space, distance and velocity, do not in themselves express this origin in a one. Why not? Electricity did, because the positive and the negative were both like parts of one whole, right? They're opposed to each other. But time and space, they don't necessarily have to be opposed to each other. As a matter of fact, you can think of time without necessarily thinking of space. At least Hegel thinks so. I mean, there are certain theories of time where time is, directly connected with space. Sure, right. But Hegel is pointing out that, at least in the abstract, you can think the passage of time without thinking space. As a matter of fact, if you think about what's going on with René Descartes' evil demon hypothesis, time is passing for the Cartesian subject for whom there may be no spatiality whatsoever, right? So we can, in fact, conceive of time as separate from space. Could we conceive of space as separate from time? Why not? Purely static universe. Nothing ever happens. Nothing changes. That's a live possibility, at least for the intellect or the understanding, isn't it? So he says, time without space, distance at least without velocity, just as, in practice, their magnitudes are indifferent to one another. So they're not related to each other as positive and negative. They're not related to one another through their own essential nature. Now, what is the upshot of this? He says the necessity of the division is certainly present here, right? We did have to divide motion to conceptualize it adequately, right? To bring all of the particulars that we want into the law. In order to do that, to make them intelligible and to make their differences, like say red and blue or tasty and not so tasty, no longer matter and make them just be factors of these things, we had to introduce these distinctions. We had to introduce those, and that is what's expressed in the equations that comprise the abstract notion of the force, right? So that act was necessary. But there's no necessary relationship between time and space, or distance and velocity. You can arrange these in all different sorts of ways. There is no necessity there, right? So in a certain sense, the stuff that we're actually working with isn't necessary. What are the implications for this? He says it's just for this reason that the first necessity, too, is itself only a sham. False necessity. This isn't even necessary, because the relation between these parts or these factors or these moments is not necessary. The division between them is itself not necessary. Now we're in trouble, aren't we? Because, we want necessity, and we think that, we're thinking about the laws of motion. Those seem to really, express necessity, and now we're finding out that they don't, according to Hegel. He says, why is this? Motion is not itself thought of as something simple or as a pure essence, but in a different way, as already divided. What do we experience in terms of motion? I move towards you, right? Did you experience, distinct magnitudes of time and space? I mean, in a certain respect, they're being mapped out by the camera, right? That's why we can do things frame by frame and do all sorts of cool things with Photoshop and editing and stuff like that. Yes, but this is just a facsimile of movement. It's not the real movement that I was actually making. Although that movement is gone. We saw that with sense certainty, right? But real movement, the thing that the law is supposed to really help us conceptualize, is not actually a matter of magnitudes of time and space, or distance and velocity. Those help us to describe it. Those, you might say, are kind of like a armature or a grid or a set of mathematical tools that we use to make sense of motion. But actual motion is not that. It approximates to it, or rather they approximate to it, to motion, but they don't express the necessity of motion. So he says, motion is not itself thought of as something simple or as a pure essence, but is already divided. Time and space are in themselves its independent parts or essences, or distance and velocity, are modes of being or ways of thinking, either of which can well be without the other, and motion is therefore only their superficial relation, not their essence. We want to grasp the essence of things when we're grasping forces and laws. He says, if it's thought of as a simple essence or a force, motion is no doubt gravity, but that doesn't contain these differences at all. That's not going to help, just recurring to gravity. So what have we seen here? Electricity had certain issues with it when we were talking about that, as sort of letting us grasp the essential nature of things. Same thing with motion itself. We're finding some interesting wrinkles in this. We're thinking that we have our hands on necessity, and then it's turning out that that's not really the case. The difference then in both cases is not a difference in its own self. Either the universal force is indifferent to the division which is the law, or the differences, the parts of the law, are indifferent to one another. The understanding, however, has the notion of this implicit difference just because the law is, on the one hand, the inner implicit being, but is, at the same time, inwardly differentiated. That this difference is thus an inner difference follows from the fact that the law is a simple force, or is the notion of the difference, and is therefore a difference belonging to the notion. But this inner difference still falls, to begin with, only within the understanding, and is not yet posited in the thing itself. It is, therefore, only its own necessity that is asserted by the understanding. The difference, then, is posited by the understanding in such a way that, at the same time, it is expressly stated that the difference is not a difference belonging to the thing itself. This necessity, which is merely verbal, is thus a recital of the moments constituting the cycle of the necessity. The moments are indeed distinguished, but at the same time their difference is expressly said to be not a difference of the thing itself, and it consequently is itself immediately cancelled again. This process is called explanation. A law is enunciated from this. Its implicitly universal element or ground is distinguished as force. But it is said that this difference is no difference, rather that the ground is constituted exactly the same as law. The single occurrence of lightning, for example, is apprehended as a universal, and this universal is enunciated as the law of electricity. The explanation then condenses the law into force as the essence of the law. This force then is so constituted that when it is expressed, opposite electricities appear, which disappear again into one another. That is, force is constituted exactly the same as law. There is said to be no difference whatever between them. The differences are the pure universal expression of law and pure force, but both have the same content or the same constitution. Thus, the difference qua difference of content, the thing, is also again withdrawn. Section 154 begins by talking about this difference, or differences, that we've just revealed as not really being necessary. This is one of the issues with law. What we think that we're grasping as having a certain necessity to it that allows us to get to the heart of things turns out not to have that sort of necessity. So he says, the difference then in both cases, what are both cases? In both cases of what we were looking at in the last section, the differences between the ways in which motion was being expressed. He says, it's not a difference in its own self. Either the universal force is indifferent to the division, which is the law, right? So the force is indifferent to the law, is indifferent to the differences that are built into the law, or the differences, the parts of the law, are indifferent to each other. We've got a double problem in either case, right? Neither one gives us necessity then, if it's merely indifferent. So he says, the understanding, however, has the notion of this implicit difference, just because the law is, on the one hand, the inner implicit being. What I've got here is we've got the workings of the law as in the world as in themselves. And then we have the understanding and its sort of reconstruction for itself, its grasp, you might say, how it takes in what it's finding, how it's conceptualizing it. So the understanding, to go back to this, he says the understanding has the notion of this implicit difference. So there is a difference between them going on, just because the law is, on the one hand, the inner implicit being, but it's inwardly differentiated. See, so the law itself has differences that are inwardly differentiated from each other. That's the way the understanding is making sense of it. On the other hand, the force, as he says, that this difference is an inner difference follows from the fact that law is a simple force, or is the notion of the difference, the grasp, the concept of the difference, the way in which the understanding is actually making sense of this. So it's a difference belonging to the notion. Now here's where it gets really interesting. He said, we've got a difference going on here. We also have something that appears to be necessity at this point. And he says, this inner difference still falls, to begin with, only within the understanding and is not yet posited in the thing itself, in what it is that we're trying to study, in what it is that we're trying to make sense of. It gets a little bit more complicated when the thing we're trying to study is, say, human beings, right? Or the laws of consciousness. But put that aside for a moment. So he says, it's therefore only its own necessity that is asserted by the understanding. So before, what we saw is we thought we had necessity here, within the differences. We thought we had necessity in two different ways, namely that the differences had to be differentiated from each other, and they had to be differentiated the way that they were, and that they had a necessary relation to each other. And that, you could say, is really an expression of the fact that that force does express itself, and it expresses itself through some sort of bifurcation or trifurcation, or however many things we want to distinguish there, right? But we saw that we don't really have this. Hegel is saying that the understanding, in its reconstruction of what's going on out here, it introduces a kind of necessity, but that is coming from the understanding itself. That should always be a little suspect, right? Whenever we find that we're trying to make sense out of some sort of complex set of phenomena, and we're observing some regularities, and we think that we have the general structure of things, but then we discover that the reason we think so is because that's an artifact of our own production, an artifact of our own processes, of the way that we framed it for ourselves. We should be wary about then assuming that that necessity is out here in the thing itself. There's plenty of cases where we create imaginary worlds that work according to certain laws, but those laws don't turn out to be the way things really are. So that's a recurring issue. So he goes on and he says, this inner difference falls only within the understanding. It's not yet posited within the thing itself. So it's only its own necessity. It's the understanding's own necessity that is asserted by the understanding. The difference then is posited by the understanding in such a way that at the same time it's expressly stated the difference is not a difference belonging to the thing itself. So we have a scission here now between the thing itself and the way that the understanding is making sense of that thing. The concept, if we want to talk in those terms, the concept is not mapping on exactly to the thing. And what we've got here is a complex metaphysical concept of law, of the way things are supposed to be articulated, how they work in their heart of their being. So he goes on and he says, this necessity, which was merely verbal, is thus a recital of the moments constituting the cycle of the necessity. What does that mean? The necessity is falling here on the side of the understanding, and the understanding is going through a process of recapitulating to itself when it's working to try to make sense of some sort of phenomenon in terms of law. It's providing itself what Hegel is about to call an explanation. This is a recapitulation, a recital of the moments constituting the cycle of the necessity. He says the moments are indeed distinguished, but at the same time their difference is said not to be a difference of the thing itself. Consequently, it is itself immediately canceled. This process, this cycle of providing sort of a vision for itself of how these things are connected with each other, when they're not necessarily so over here, is an explanation. So he says, a law is enunciated from this, right? So we have a law. How does it happen? Its implicitly universal element or ground is distinguished as force. But it is said that this difference is no difference. The ground is constituted exactly the same as the law. The single occurrence of lightning, over here, right? This is the lightning as occurring in reality, we could say, occurring external to us. Here is the lightning as occurring for us within the scope of our understanding. And the lightning is then broken down into the force of electricity and the way in which electricity is actually expressed with the polarities, positive, negative. I forget whether it's positive electricity that's trying to get to the negative or the other way around for lightning. I don't remember my earth science. But that's what we're construing for ourselves. That's an explanation we're providing to ourselves. That's not actually the thing itself. So he says a single occurrence is apprehended as what? As a universal, as the law of electricity. The explanation then condenses the law into force as the essence of the law. The force is so constituted that when it's expressed, opposite electricities appear, which disappear again into each other. That is, force in the understanding is in fact constituted the same way as law, not what's going on over here. So we've got, again, a difference being introduced between what's happening for the understanding and what's happening for law. Of course, all of this is for consciousness, so there's a good question here. Well, how are we able to compare these with each other? How is the external able to be differentiated from the internal, or the internal of what really is from our external viewpoint upon it? Those are important questions, and Hegel is going to consider them soon. But what he really wants to stress here is that any appearance of necessity is coming from the understanding, sort of imposing that. And what we have going on is the fact that law and force are now essentially being equated with each other and substitutable for each other. So he says, the differences are the pure universal expression of law, right? Differences and pure force. Both have the same content, the same constitution. Thus, the difference, qua difference of content of the thing, is also withdrawn. So we come again to one of these moments where we say, look, things are not only not as we thought they were, but the things that we were taking as being stable points have started to shift, And this cannot be an adequate explanation, to use a word in a different way. This cannot be an adequate account for ourselves because the things that we're using to articulate that account are unraveling. They are, as Hegel says, vanishing. So we're going to have to go further now in figuring out what's going on with law and force.